Okay, so for this podcast, this is just a brief analysis of the criteria, the assessment criteria for the analysis of an issue for using language to persuade in VCE English. So we'll get stuck back into it. I won't do so many crazy eyebrow manoeuvres this time. Okay, so this is the description of the task. The task says that we need to analyse the use of language in text that present a point of view on an issue currently debated in the Australian media. Most of the latter half of that sentence is taken care of for you because the text will be presented to you on the date of the SAC. However, the core of this is to analyse the use of language. So we're analysing language. Remember this as we go all the way through. Now, I know this can be a bit of a factor for some of us. Some of us feel like this not only with language analysis, but also a whole bunch of different tasks in English. You'll get into a class and your teacher will explain the structure that they require from you, and you'll think to yourself, I am so sure that we were told a different thing last year, and you might start to feel a little bit confused about that. I wanted to just briefly touch on that. First of all, the reason that that's the case is that an English essay or any kind of essay doesn't follow a mathematical formula. There's no logical formulaic process to go through. So what is actually happening when a teacher gives you an instruction for the structure of a piece? They're trying to give you advice as to how to address the criteria at the highest level. They're giving you that advice based upon their own thinking processes, based upon the high level of success that they've seen in previous students, and also based upon their previous assessments of other students and how it has worked and how it doesn't work. So when you get something like TEAL, or the method that I like to use for this task is PDE, what's actually happening there is that the teacher is explaining to you the nature of an effective piece of writing. They're not prescribing a certain formulaic approach. So my advice to you is, if you want to make sure that you do well all the way through, you need to know the assessment criteria. You can't do well at any task unless you know what well looks like. You need to know what well is in order to be able to do it. So the assessment criteria is a window into the mind of the assessor as they mark your work. And that's why it's really important to know it. The assessment criteria here is universal across the state of Victoria. This is in the assessment handbook, so it's the official criteria. That's why it's important to know. The second thing is and one way of being able to know the assessment criteria and what it looks like, what good looks like, is to read the assessment reports, which are given out every single year. And they're published on the internet. You can read through those and you can see how people have gone past, what kind of things they've done well and what kinds of mistakes that they've made. The last piece of evidence that I'll give you is follow your teacher's advice. If they say to structure it in a certain way, they are going to be assessors for that task. This is particularly true of SACs. So when you sit a SAC and a teacher instructs you to structure that piece of writing in a particular way, make sure that you do follow that advice, because not only are they going to be the ones who assess that piece of writing, but they are going to be the ones, if in a cross-marking situation there's a disagreement, they're going to be the ones who are responsible for upholding the instruction that they've given you. So it's important to do that. Okay, let's move on to the criteria itself. Well, look at this, I've created slides for this and haven't talked through them. Here be reminded, this is the kind of the last point that I made, who is your target audience? Well, your target audience is actually your assessor. So making sure that you know who's assessing you and what they're going to look for is really important. Okay, so this is the way that it is structured in the actual Assessor's Handbook. There is a series of paragraphs of descriptors, and they can actually be broken up into individual sentences. So you can see there that there is descriptive language, adjectives within those that we can pull apart and analyse. I did this for my students. So what I've done there is simply broken up the sentences, and I've put them next to each other to show you what very high, the highest bracket, what the descriptors are there, and as it goes down, the kinds of descriptors that are relevant to each of the different brackets. So you notice that they're in bold here, and we're going to have a bit of a look at those now. Okay, so the first sentence in each of the different categories is this sentence which reads something along the lines of, we read the medium skill one there, analysis of the ways in which the language of selected persuasive text is used to position readers in particular ways. Now I should say, just back here, what I've done here is I've got a not shown category. That is not in the official criteria. What I wanted to make sure to allow in my assessment of students' work is sometimes if you've got a particular element that you need, sometimes the student doesn't do it at all. So I've allowed myself the not shown criteria to explain that the student hasn't done that, hasn't met that criteria, even at the very low skill level. It doesn't happen often, thankfully. Okay, so if we see the quality of analysis, the lowest end there, you'll see that for low there's some analysis, for very low there is little analysis, and for not shown, what I've got there is no apparent analysis. And as you go down further towards the low end, what you get there is a simple regurgitation of the content, or maybe even a paraphrase of the content of the pieces themselves. So we need to make sure that we are not at all simply paraphrasing the content. And as you go up towards the middle, you are getting less and less of that, and you are getting more and more. So some actually indicates a quantity of analysis, little indicates a quantity of analysis. That means the more analysis you include in your piece of writing, the higher you can score on this. So in the medium skill you've got simple analysis. Might be a bit vague, but what you've got there is simply to say that maybe you could say that mostly analysis, or it is mostly consisting of analysis of ways in which the language of selected persuasive text, they're already given to you, is used to position readers in particular ways. Okay, so at the higher end you've got a detailed and a sophisticated analysis, and the question that you might have is, what does that mean? What does it mean to have a detailed and sophisticated analysis? I think there are two really good questions that you can ask yourself to be able to address this at a sophisticated level. First question is, how does language, or specifically rhetoric, support the argument? So how is, the arguments should be there, but how is language used to bolster the effect of those arguments? How is language used to be able to make that argument much more, have much greater impact on the audience? And the second question, the second part of it is, what is the effect of the language on the target audience? Now, my suggestions to you in terms of how to put that in your essay is to ensure that the bulk of your body paragraphs consist of those answers to those two questions. The bulk of your paragraphs need to explain how language is used to bolster the argument or support the argument, and how language is used to affect the target audience. Most of your paragraph should be consisting of those things. Use as many quotations as you can to support that, to justify that analysis, and so that would be that. Moving on. So, quality of comparison is actually the next criteria. This is an interesting one. You'll notice here that the medium skill says the word some comparison, whereas with the quality of analysis, the low skill says some analysis. So if the medium skill says some comparison, that means there is less of an emphasis on comparison than there is on analysis. The comparison is still necessary, it is still one of the criteria, but there is less of an emphasis on it according to this criteria. Now I think there's a couple of things that you can do here to address this in your piece of writing. I think a useful thing to do is in your closing paragraph, identify, so closing maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs, identify in each paragraph one or more holistic differences in the language use between the two pieces. So one language piece might have a more simplified vocabulary, use more simplified vocabulary, whereas one piece might be more complex and thus more exclusionary. And then after you've identified a holistic language difference between the two, then go on to explain how that affects the target audience. That's one way of doing it. There are a lot of different other ways of doing it, but the basis is that you need to be doing some, how much comparison and how effective that comparison is will award you different categories under this criteria. Okay, use of meta-language. This is an interesting one. I find it's quite interesting to note that when you're teaching something like biology, there is a set of terms that come along with that kind of subject. But if you don't learn those terms, then you simply cannot do well in that subject. It's like talking a different language. There is a subset or a dialect associated with different subjects. This is true. Different skill areas, different work areas, all have their different uses of technical terminology that are relevant to those areas. This is true of English, and we might not realise this up front because we think, we all speak English, but in this particular area of study, there is a particular subset of language that you need to learn and you need to understand and be able to use. So meta-language is simply a language that describes language, and this is shown through the use of not only persuasive devices, but also things like understanding word types, understanding sentence structures, understanding how punctuation is used, and using language that pertains to that in your piece of writing, in your analysis. So obviously you've got there a low category of skill there, a low degree of skill. You use some appropriate meta-language, which increases as you go higher. Notice the high skill is relevant. That means that at a high skill, you use enough meta-language, and every use of meta-language is relevant to the device that it names, or that it identifies. Whereas there is a very interesting definition with the very high skill. You've got a confident use of highly appropriate meta-language. So the idea there is that your use of meta-language is so natural to the way that you speak. You've fully absorbed the meta-language into your own vocabulary, into your own lexicon, that you, in a very natural way, use it in your analysis, in a very sophisticated way too. So that's what differentiates those top two, which is interesting, the interesting differentiation. Okay. Lastly, we've got this one, the quality of writing, which is really important. This, in some ways, is more important than all the others. In some ways, it is. The idea here is that the quality of your writing, or the clarity of your writing, is like a window. If the clarity of the window is very clear, if it's very good, then we can see your ideas through the other side. We can see what's on the other side. If the clarity of your language is really good, then we can see what you mean. And saying what you mean can be very tricky. So notice here, and I think this is quite crazy, you got the very low skill has simple expression, but the low skill has clear. So in order to get a low skill, one of the lowest categories, you need to write clearly, which is a pretty big deal. Writing clearly can be hard sometimes. And that, obviously, as it goes up, generally expressive, coherent, and then highly expressive. One thing I'll say there as well is that coherence talks about the structure of your piece. The expressiveness is about the vocabulary that you use, and the fluency is about the quality of your grammatical structures, so your sentence structure and things like that. Okay, I think that's it. Good luck with your